Good morning. I'm Margie Daniels. I'm the Executive Director of Massachusetts Partnerships for Youth, and I'm on a couple of minutes early. We're not starting till 9, and we'll give people a little bit of a chance to come in before we really start getting going. But I wanted to welcome anybody who is already on. You're the early birds, which is good. And
Say hello to us in the chat box and tell us who you are, the early birds.
I'll say hello too right now. Make sure. Yep, there I am. And that's Nancy Rappaport, by the way. I will introduce her better in a few minutes. But yeah, if people could say hello, that would be awesome.
And tell us what you do. I'd love to know.
Yeah. Oh, New Bedford, new member of MPY. That's awesome.
Oh,
Jen Hogan-Cayley. Hi, Jen. That's so exciting.
who else is there? Margie, I can't see on my chat box.
Oh, all kinds of people. Wait a minute, I have to turn it on. I just got a hilarious text from my daughter.
What did you say?
I don't want to say it.
Oh, was it something to do with our chief?
About something maybe she shouldn't be as happy as she seems to be about. Leave it at that.
Okay.
Jen Hogan-Cayley, who's on, works with my daughter. So,
Oh, who else has told you they're there?
Laura is a school counselor at a 766 school. Jamie Millett is an LICSW from Lunenburg, new member. I love seeing new members on. Walter is a team chairperson at North Shore Academy Upper School. And I just love Michelle. So you must work with Michelle, Walter. Rosalie is going so fast, I can't keep up with it.
That's okay.
Salem, I think. Ben, school counselor from Bedford. Katie, evaluation team chair in Fall River. Yes, Fall River, another new member. Oh, I'm thrilled. Sarah's an LICSW in Somerville. I love Somerville. Mary Ann Mello, school psychologist, team chair from Bellingham. Boy, we've got a lot of team chairs here. Laura is a school adjustment intern in Hudson, and she's training to be a social worker, which I am. That's wonderful. Jen is a school nurse in Medford. Becca works in Sharon, another new member. Hi, Sharon. Kelly is an SAC LMHC in Dedham. And I'm reading all this just so you know, because
no, I so appreciate it. Keep going. I'm writing everybody down because I can talk to them.
And I apologize if I missed anybody. Sarah's a social worker in Beverly. Hi, Sarah. You must know my daughter. Eric is a guidance counselor at Triton. I love Brian Forget. Kimberly Politano, assistant principal at Saugus Middle High School. Yes, my husband grew up in Saugus. School adjustment counselor Maura from Tewksbury. Sean Thomas, 8th grade adjustment counselor and LMHC at Roosevelt Middle School. Where is Roosevelt Middle School, Sean? I don't know where that is. Put it in the chat if you would. Amanda's a school psych at Crest. Great.
Where's Crest?
Crest is in Methuen. It's a collaborative. Sean from New Bedford. Okay, thank you, Sean. Kathleen, school adjustment counselor at Greater Lawrence Tech School. Daphna's a middle school social worker in Billerica. I love Tim Pavara, your superintendent, has been a great friend of mine for many years. Who else? Maureen from Salem. Maureen, hello, director of Out of District. I used to do Out of District at one point. The most fun I think I ever had in my career. I loved doing Out of District. Well, because you get to go out and you see so many interesting settings. Regina, school psych in Watertown. Steve Marshall, assistant principal in Somerville. Kim is administrator of social work and SEL. Chelsea, great. So many team chairs here, amazing. Tanya's a certified prevention specialist in Boston. How are you on, Tanya? Boston is not a member. That's interesting.
Don't rat them out. I'm happy to have Boston. I know Andrea Amanor. It's great. Now nobody's going to talk on chat. She's my guest.
Lisa, okay. Lisa O'Neill, team chair in Salem. Carol, director of specialized instruction in Salem. So yeah, I'm thrilled with all these team chairs. That's really fabulous. Team chairs
Yes.
have such an interesting lot in life. Did it for a
Yeah.
long time. It's an interesting position. Marianne is a clinical coordinator at Bridges Transition Program in Bellingham. Bellingham's another new member. Welcome to Bellingham. And let's see what time it is. Well, we'll chat for a few more minutes as people come aboard. Anybody else want to introduce themselves? We have 75 people on now, which is good. We have, I think, about 160 signed up for this webinar, but as you know, some people will be able to watch it remotely, so everyone won't necessarily be here. We have Anna now, who's a psychologist in Lawrence. My very first job was in Lawrence Public Schools many, many moons ago. Jessica from the Middlebrook Behaviors, from Middlebrook. No, Jessica Middlebrook, I'm sorry. Behavior specialist from the Cambridge Public Schools. Oh, welcome, Cambridge. John Silva is a good friend of mine in Cambridge.
I love him.
You love him too?
Specialist. Yeah, I worked in Cambridge for 23 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. John has always been a great, great friend to me through the years. Well, we seem to be slowing down with our introductions. Meredith said, yes, if you leave a bit early, that's a good question, Meredith. Yes, you'll get the link and you can watch it. And there may be some people who are going to watch it again because it will be so fabulously good. Alice, Alice LICSW from New Bedford again. Oh, so happy to see New Bedford people here. But yeah, with the link, keep in mind it'll only be active for 72 hours. But yeah, if you leave early, you'll have a chance of viewing the whole thing. So I'm going to start to talk now. It was a dilemma when we started the fall series, and this is our very, our second webinar in the start of the fall series, but it was would it be possible to use closed captioning during this presentation? I don't know. Beth is my expert here. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know. Beth would have to weigh in on that. We had a dilemma.
What we could say is if we can't do it now, I'm sure we'll be able to figure it out for the next webinar, because it must mean that it might be that someone's hard of hearing.
Yeah, I don't know. I suggest that Lauren maybe communicate directly with Beth. You can email her at Beth, her first name, BETH, at mpyinc.org. And like Nancy says, maybe we would be able to do it in the future. So let Beth know what your needs are and we'll do our best. So we had a dilemma when we got going with the webinars after the summer ended, because people are back at school and everybody's on such different schedules. It struck us that no matter what time we do it, it's not good for someone. I had some people weighing in and said, do 3 to 5 when everyone's done with school. That doesn't work for a lot of people because they're in transit, they're cooking dinner or whatever. 10 to 12, works great for some people. Today we're doing 9 to 11. That's fabulous for some people, but not for others. We have some in the afternoon. So anyway, make a long story short, we decided that we're going to record all of our webinars now and make them available by a link just for 72 hours after the actual presentation. So that's a real change for us, and I hope that will be helpful with people. We've gotten a really good reaction so far. So a link of the recording of the live webinar will be emailed to everyone who registered, and again, you'll have access to the link for 72 hours. We will put up an information sheet at the end of this, but I'll just tell you a couple of things ahead of time, especially for the people who are new to MPY. The evaluation PDP CEU request forms can be found on our website, which is www.mpyinc.org. Click webinars. And then the title of the webinar you attended and the information links can be found in red. So again, if you're not following what I'm saying, it will all be written at the end. Just make sure you stay on to read it. We give a 6-character code for accountability purposes, and right before I introduce Nancy, I'm going to give you the first three letters. She'll give you the last three, and that way we won't interrupt her great presentation with
Thanks.
and you need these codes, you need these digits or characters to put in when you fill out your forms for CEUs or PDPs. So keep track of the code, please. A certificate of attendance will be mailed after each webinar to participants. And you'll get a certificate at the end of this 10-hour training, which, you know, again, it's nice because 10 hours, we're able to award PDPs at that point. You only have to do the form at the end of the 5 sessions. So let me see what else I have to tell you. We mail out the PDP and CEU certificates at the end of the year, unless anybody is in a bind. I know now for social workers, you know, it's changed. It's our birthdays rather than the set date of October 1st as it used to be. So if anybody's bumping up against a recertification requirement or relicensure requirement, get in touch with us and we'll certainly do what we can to help you. The slides will be made available with the approval of the presenter after the webinar. And I think that's all I have to say. Before I forget, let me give you the first 3 digits of the code. It's MD, as in medical doctor, 7.
And it's little letters.
Little letters, that's right. Thank you, Nancy. Lowercase m, lowercase d, 7. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Rappaport, who's Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And she's been working with us now for a while and is just an absolute favorite. She is a phenomenal presenter, so knowledgeable. And I love it because I feel like I'm just sitting right across from her, having a conversation with her. She's so down to earth and easy to be with. And many of you may know her from the Behavior Code. She co-authored the Behavior Code, which I know many of you have read. And she's going to talk about Beyond the Threat, how to tip the balance towards safety in schools while considering the needs and challenges of individual students. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Rappaport.
So good morning.
Oh, and also I have one more thing to say because Nancy will get involved in her presentation. Beth is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you occasionally hear another voice, it's Beth, who's our prevention and education coordinator and is fabulous. So many of you know Beth because she's the person that you request in-service trainings through. So anyway, take it away, Nancy.
Thank you. So here we are, Beyond the Threat, how to tip the balance towards safety in schools while considering the challenges and needs of individual students. So before we start, I want to give you a virtual hug from my house to your house. And I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm from Boston and I've been here my whole life. I'm a performer, teacher, and writer at heart. I created and performed in a one-woman show on Off Broadway. And I was a teacher before medical school in Harlem for preschool through 3rd grade. And I co-wrote the Behavior Code in a memoir. So I bring that passion for playfulness, storytelling, and my love of teaching to my work as a child psychiatrist. So I want us to have fun, and I want us to be playful, and I want us to learn. And another fun fact about me is that I ran the Boston Marathon 13 times. Which brings me to you. So what we've embarked on in this 10-hour series is it's going to be a marathon and it may have some of the heartbreak hills. And my job is to pace us and to give you practical information you can bring back to your districts. And one of my personal hopes is that we take some of the learning that we're going to be able to do together, and we have some incredible thought leaders in this space that will be talking with us over this next 10 hours. And I want to make it available to other educators and who are also struggling through this messy process of doing threat and safety assessments. And so I heard from just hearing the introductions at the beginning that you all shared with us, some of you are seasoned clinicians and you are team chairs, you've done multiple assessments. You're the thought leader in your school district around how to approach threat and safety assessments. And others of you might be relatively new to this material. I heard that there's some interns in social work and beginning practicing clinicians. For those of you who are newer, I ask that you give yourself the time to understand and digest this framework by treating this as protected time. So if you can turn off distractions, take notes, and please participate in chat. Your questions are incredibly important in orienting all of us. And for those of you who are more seasoned, I also encourage you to treat this as protected time and approach this as you're listening to me lecture, and maybe some of these concepts are familiar to you. What are some key concepts your staff needs to understand? And what are some concrete action steps that they need to take and you need to take? And are you communicating these ideas to them in a way that fundamentally allows them to approach kids with challenging behavior and threatening behaviors in a more effective way? So I want to make a distinction. Threat assessments is a relatively new field. 1999 was Columbine. The Safe School Initiative, which was the report that came out in 2004, and now we have some more data that's coming out in 2018 and 2020. But this is really a beginning field. It's very different than the training that many of us have gotten around suicide assessments, which is a relatively developed field in how to keep our children safe. And what we're going to be doing during this time is working with thought partners, some incredible presenters. And I run the Harvard School Mental Health course. I'm a co-director there. And I know how to identify really good speakers. And these are thought partners who are teaching us how to be more effective in creating sustainable cultures of safety in schools. And that's really a huge offering that we can do. So let me just run through some of the people that will be speaking with us. So Dr. Goodrum, she's a research associate with the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence at the University of Colorado Boulder. And she's a sociologist. And she, her first research area, she co-authored a book, After Homicide, Victims' Families in the Criminal Justice System. And what she told me yesterday when I was talking to her is that she likes the idea of learning and understanding topics where there is great pain and sometimes avoidance, with the idea of shining light on the darkness. So how she did that was her second area of expertise. A sheriff approached her after a school shooting, and she did 8,000 pages of interviews with school personnel, unpacking what happened with that school shooting. And her report is currently being used as a way to understand information sharing and threat assessment. So she will show during her presentation the role of information in identifying, evaluating, and managing a student concern, the influence of culture and climate on information sharing about a student concern, which is so important. She's expanded the lens of us just looking at the individual child and thinking about a threat assessment and looking at what's going on in schools. We all know that there are different schools that have better or worse ways of sharing information and strategies for addressing culture and climate to promote safety. Dr. Weisbrot is a clinical professor of psychiatry. She'll be talking on November 6th in the Department of Psychiatry at Stony Brook University. And she is a full-time consulting child and adolescent psychiatrist for several therapeutic schools for children and adolescents. And there's probably 3 child psychiatrists, me being one of them, who are considered national experts in doing threat or safety assessments. And she has vast clinical experience. She works in Long Island. She has hair-raising cases that she's worked with. And she will be sharing the clinical challenges involved in performing high-risk threat assessments. She'll introduce you to concepts like Autism Plus and essential aspects of the threat assessment interview, and how to think about strategies when dealing with students presenting with complex psychiatric problems. So she's an incredibly seasoned clinician that I've presented with, and just a total treat, all of these guys. And then you all may know Michelle Garcia-Winner, who developed social thinking and treatment of individuals with social learning challenges. And Laura Therabudu, they'll be presenting on November 13th. And she's a 4th-year medical student at Tufts School of Medicine and a former teacher. And both of them I recruited. Laura is working with me, doing research on asking on how to support the pattern of kids on the spectrum who are perseverative on violent themes or express themselves in provocative ways. So I'm always looking for gaps in the literature. And one of the places we have a gap in the literature is how to respond to kids on the spectrum when they are not school shooters. And we know there's been a lot of stigma around that with Adam Lanza, but where they do have some behavior that can be challenging to schools. Our last speaker will be Dr. Meredith Ganser. She's an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a child psychiatrist at the Cambridge Health Alliance. And she's young. She's just 3 years out of her training, but she is a total dynamo. I've been on TV with her, and she, with no training, just knows exactly how to talk about, and will be talking with us about the essential question of how to manage threat in a time of social media and other digital technologies. And I also want to say she's been doing research on problematic digital use in adolescents. And so that's our lineup. And so in some ways, it's a weird time to be thinking about threat assessments right now. It's a weird time, period. I mean, some of you might have heard the news last night of what happened with our president and his wife, but you know, we don't know. Some of us in our school districts may be doing hybrid learning, maybe doing total virtual learning, and that's been going on since March. And yet there's an even greater need for safety when kids return to schools. And we can't help but think of the context of what's going on with the police brutality and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, just to end some of the protests. And that also means that when kids come back into school, they may be feeling more vulnerable and have stronger responses when they're school resource officers. And that with the hybrid learning, we also have a huge gap that kids may be bringing into school with learning. So I just wanted to give us the context for where we are. And also, I'll be mentioning it again, but what the National Threat Assessment Center has shown in 2019 is that often there are an uptick in threats when kids return to school after long breaks like summer or winter. So our idea of preparing carefully for when kids return so that we can have evidence-based and appropriate responses to kids it's great. I'm so glad that you are investing this time with me. So now I'm going to just switch and go over what we'll be covering today. So we'll be talking about what are schools doing in the name of prevention and deterrence right now. Somewhere you'll see I have some strong opinions about whether they're actually evidence-based. What kind of safety threat assessments work? And what evidence-based framework do you need to bring back to your community to enhance your safety assessment process? And how do we create a reflexive process that builds capacity to support families, schools, and students? And something I've heard a lot from districts is, or from you if you're a team chair, is how do you get your school to buy in and anticipate obstacles? And my question to you is, how do you return to your community as a well-equipped safety ambassador? So as you're listening to this lecture, I want you to be pulling out things that you want to bring back to your school and share with us at the end. So as I mentioned, you want to watch for an uptick in threats after a break. And this is from the National Threat Assessment Center. We already know that some people are getting creative about doing, that's not exactly the right word, destructive, about Zoom bombing, and that there may be threats that are appearing even if we end up being in a virtual model at our schools. Always, when we are approaching safety, I choose to call it safety, threat assessments or safety assessments, we want to both be able to create a level of calm and be vigilant and be vigilant and contain the fear. So it's like a dyad kind of aspect. And we can't talk about safety assessments until we talk about the school climate. And whenever I'm talking about doing safety assessments, I'm always thinking that that's embedded in primary and secondary preventions, which many of you, I heard that there's an assistant principal listening right now, and many educators were thinking about how is this embedded in the primary and secondary preventions. And one of the things that I know from having done research on I've probably done over 400 assessments and supervised up to 2,000 assessments. And many of those kids come from a history of trauma. And so I would just want to highlight that thinking about the questions that, and I realize you can't read the survey questions, but there's a terrific survey on the Trauma Responsive School Implementation Assessment website. And it looks at the kinds of things like, do kids feel like if they're worried about something, will anything be done? Do they understand what the protocols are for reporting, anonymous reporting? And it has and then talks about how I always find when we talk about trauma sensitive schools, I'm not exactly sure what they mean. And this is really a step-by-step. And I think when we have a strong school that knows how to be responsive to schools, we decrease the threats that are made by kids. So what are schools doing in the name of prevention and deterrence right now? And I would love to think that we are pouring money into prevention, but we are actually pouring money into militarizing the schools. And and one of the examples of it where I have spoken publicly about it is ALICE, which are lockdown, method, alert, lockdown, inform, counter, and evacuate. And this is the idea that rather than having what these companies that are making billions of dollars doing a passive response, that they want to have proactive methods. And Greg Kane, who is one of the originators there, said they can sit there and become victims, or they can do something and become a hero. To me, this is incredibly troubling. We do not have good data that ALICE works, but there are over 6,000 schools in the country that are employing ALICE, including many schools in Massachusetts. And we have had examples in May of 2019 where two students were killed in the effort to confront school shooters, and even well-trained law enforcement and personnel do not respond well under these circumstances when you have when you have to face someone who's armed. So it comes from very flimsy data, and I have worked to try to raise the level of concern about that. And the other major concern that I have is if you look at the ACLU report, cops not counselors, we are out of balance with school resources. There are 14 million students are in schools with police, but no counselors, social workers, psychologists, or nurses. So, and the problem is, and again, there are many, I've worked with many good school resource officers who are well-trained, but within our state and within the country, we have Black students are 3 times more likely to be arrested than that of white students. And I know many of us who I'm speaking to today are social workers and counselors and psychologists, and that's just important data I want you to have in terms of when we're advocating. This is a really sad slide. This is the idea that we are treating and parenting the first generation to grow up with live shooter drills and constant knowledge of the reality of mass shootings. And this was a sculpture made by Manuel Oliver, whose 17-year-old son, Joaquin, was killed in Parkland High School. And on top of it, it's etched in the desk are the stats of gun violence, which is that 22 kids are shot by guns each day. And also, along with it, a number to text to prompt voter registration for all of us who want to make sure that happens. But it's troubling to me that we are having these kind of lockdowns. And I was giving a presentation, and one of the participants talked to me about the fact that her 6-year-old daughter was having repetitive play of lockdowns and shootouts, and that kids are really troubled by this and having an uptick of anxiety. The other thing that's going on is that we are having a hardening of the schools. So Johnson, who is a researcher out of Kentucky, talks about the moral panic that people are in, where something must be done. And so that we have, and why I'm bringing this up at the beginning is that there's minimal research that school resource officers help, even though we have a school resource officer in every single school. And that when the school shootings have happened, there's often been a security guard in there, and that hasn't deterred the active shooting. So, so what kind of safety assessments work? So for some of you, you will be familiar with the concept of Safe School Initiative, which I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on. But what I want to emphasize is human detectors, not medical detectors. And I call, even though the Safe School Initiative and Dewey Cornell's work, they call it threat assessment. I call it safety assessment. And the reason I do that is that I want us to focus on the protective factors. So if you as a team leader or are initiating this, I would really encourage us to call this safety assessment. Having done research with parents families and kids who've had these kind of threat assessments, I can tell you that even when it's a transient threat, they feel stigmatized. And I think changing the language would help with that. So here is the million dollar question. What's the difference between typical behavior and concerning behavior? Is this threat that a kid made just a garden variety teenager who is got provocative impulsive behavior with a low frustration threshold? Or is this a student with concerning behavior? And some of the things that I want to highlight this, and this comes from O'Toole's work, who was part of the Safe School Initiative, is that the things that we may really worry about are bizarre statements or behavior. So we know that there's a small percentage of students who have been involved with mass school shootings who are psychotic. And when you have a psychotic student, all bets are off in terms of being able to predict violence. But I've certainly worked with some students who have had emerging psychosis and gotten them into treatment and been able to keep them in school. So they're some of the challenging students. But when you have a student with sort of a warrior mentality where they're seeking information about weapons, when there's leakage, so the idea that many times school shooters will leak the information about what their plans are, and escalating acts of violence, increasing desperation or distress. And another one that often gets missed is agitation. And these are the markers that I would highlight. So if you do listen to this again, this is a slide I'd spend some time on with you thinking about. So here we say youth homicides in the US. 52% took place in residency, 30% took place in parking lots or on roads, and 1% to 2% in schools. So there is a 40 times higher chance of dying outside of school. And the chance of dying in school by violence or suicide are less than 1 in 2 million. That being said, I worked for 23 years in the Cambridge Public Schools, and we had a super rare event happen while I worked there, which was we had 2 terrorists come out of our school. So that was a damaging, scary time for the high school that I worked at. And when a school shooting happens, clearly it's devastating, and I don't mean to minimize it, but the perception of risk is that many, many parents are terrified and worried, and educators. And we want to make sure we communicate that it is a risk, but it's not something that's going to happen in every school. And in fact, it's a very, very unlikely event. And this slide is meant to just show that, yes, there are, in 2018, that was mid-March, there were 11 school shootings. And because people often ask me, has there been an uptick in school shootings because there's so much media coverage? But I do think I want to have us just look at, even though there were only 11, look how jaded I am, there were 11 school shootings, there were over 12,800 students who have been exposed to shooting. And that came home to me. I teach a Harvard freshman seminar, and I once was just asking kids to write about their high school experience. And one freshman, wrote an incredible piece about what her experience was of coming to school and there having been a school death. Some of you may know, in Lincoln Sudbury, which is in the suburb of Boston. And so, yes, it's rare, but it does impact a lot of people. And this is just to highlight the implied vulnerability when you think about now with police brutality, that Black students make up 16.6% of the school population, but they experience school shootings at twice that rate, at 34%. So, so I'm going to switch gears now. And again, if you're seasoned, you've heard about the Safe School Initiative, but think about this as the information you want to give. Make sure that your safety assessment team, your threat assessment team is aware of, and what this is. And for the newer clinicians, this is important. It's the anchor for all of the work that we do now doing safety assessments, and that's why I'm going to be spending time on it. It was these questions through the Safe School Initiative were developed by the Department of Ed and the FBI, and they looked at 37 targeted attacks from 1974 to 2000. And they both emphasized the idea of having a team approach, and that you ask a series of questions and have an investigative mind. This has been repackaged by the, and you can download this Enhancing School Safety using a threat assessment model. So if you have a district that doesn't have the resources to be able to access the Dewey Cornell model that I'll be talking about later, this is free, it's online, and it covers both the Safe School Initiative and is updated. And it's through the United States Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center. And you could use as a study group, and both the Safe School Initiative and this, which basically recapitulates what the Safe School Initiative did. It's imperative that your safety assessment team be aware of this model, and I'm going to walk you through it. So their key thing is the idea that you can't have a profile of a kid, and that you want to bring an investigative, skeptical, inquisitive mindset, and that's what allows you to be curious, and also that you have a safety assessment team that has multiple people on it. And I'm going to go through the team roles. And one of the things that I can say sometimes can really wear down people is when they don't share responsibility. And another thing that you want to be thinking about when you have a team is how to have redundancy, so that if the principal's out of the office, who's covering, or whatever other member. And I just want to go over the team roles. So you have the principal or the assistant principal, I heard, who lead the team. You have the school resource officer who advises team, responds to legal actions and emergencies. And then you have a mental health staff who conducts the mental health assessments and takes the lead role in follow-up interventions. And I am often asked the question, does that mental health staff member need to have a certain degree next to their name, like MSW or whatever? And what both Dewey Cornell, who I'll talk about later, who's an expert, and I would say is what's really important is someone does a good job, and that they have an ability to in the mental health staff role to make a connection to the parent and the family, and to do due diligence in getting collateral support. Another aspect that I am often asked about is what's the difference if we have in our school a crisis team versus a safety assessment team? And so a crisis team is the team that comes together if there's an emergency situation, like a fire or a tornado or a suicide in the school. And it's more broad in purpose. It mobilizes quickly and it coordinates with outside resources and identifies the students that need support. The safety team, you may have overlapping people on the team, but it's about specific threats where there's a specific purpose, which is to determine the nature of the threat and an appropriate response. And it coordinates with the local police and the school resource officer. So both teams have an aspect where they're defining their role and they're figuring out about communication. But the safety assessment team has a specialized expertise. So we're going to come back to this slide at the end, but the coordination is, I did a 5-day training for different districts, and I would encourage your school to be, when you're thinking about safety assessments, to really use it as an opportunity to also be looking at your internet policy, your crisis response plan, your emergency room protocols, and your memorandum of understanding with the police, and how these all interweave. And what I would say to any of the clinicians who are listening right now, please go over with every student you have about the weapon policy. I have lost too many kids in a school setting because they did stupid stuff, like taking out a jackknife from their after-school job, or having a jackknife in their pocket with an after-school job, or one really vulnerable kid who mom was schizophrenic. I was doing therapy at a school-based health center I worked at for 20 years, and he went to open the elevator and he had a jackknife on his keychain. And these, that's just a side to encourage us to do that. And the same thing with the internet, with each of our clinicians, that I've to talk with your students about that. I've seen kids end up having threat assessments because they did stupid stuff on the internet and they just forgot that it's a public forum. So to excuse me, there's one other thing I wanted to mention about our safety assessment team, not to confuse you, but one of the things I wanted to say that's really interesting to me, I did an article for the International Journal of Psychology, of Violence Research, and had to look at how other countries are keeping their schools safe. And of course, we all know about the fact that gun laws exist in other countries that are much stricter. But the other thing that was fascinating is, for example, in Germany, there was no school resource officer or any kind of police allowed on the safety assessment team. And in Germany, that's for understandable reasons. But it struck me how sort of when you're in your own culture, you don't notice it, you just absorb it. And that to me was sort of a wake up that we've all, I mean, maybe not all of us, but many of us have become accustomed to the idea that there are school resource officers in both our school and on our teams. And it was a wake up call to me that that's not true for all countries. So I just wanted to go over some of the statistics around school shootings that both the Secret Service and the FBI have looked at. And the parts I want to bring your attention to is that 93% of these students had planned out the attack in advance, and 93% had exhibited behavior that caused others concern prior to the attack. And if you haven't read either the Columbine book by McCullough, which is David McCullough's book, which was his first book, which was examining the Columbine in 1999 massacre, and his second book, Parkland, it highlights the multiple opportunities for intervention. And that's the good news for us. It's that it's often not a surprise attack. It's not like you have a teenager go from being a docile person to a werewolf. And at the same time, what's a little bit confusing is there is a percentage of school shooters who had no trouble in school or hadn't been suspended or disobeyed authority. So it's nuanced. Those students often may have had leakage where they had talked with other students about what they were going to do, but they went under the radar. So I'm now just going to briefly go over some of the key findings of the Safe School Initiative. And what we talked about is that there's no accurate or useful profile of students who engage in targeted school violence. And I wanted to share with you a really touching story of a participant in one of the trainings that I did, talked with me about where she was a school counselor who had done 2 assessments on a student because they was wearing a trench coat to school. And what came out as the student was graduating is that they talked about that the reason they were wearing a trench coat was really because they were questioning their gender, and it had nothing to do with being a school shooter. So, but that had raised people's alarm. And again, it's that whole question about impulsive, provocative behavior and concerning behavior and how we make that decision. But I think the school counselor was telling it to me because of the pride she had, that she in some ways had been able to contain the fear that other people had about this student, and find out what was driving that behavior. So most attackers had access to and had used weapons prior to the attack. So this is, I'm going to be throwing in little pieces of information that are a little bit of a detour, but just because I want you also to hold on to this. So this is concern. I've definitely done safety assessments on kids who have drawn pictures of guns, and maybe it was during they were asked to draw something about the Industrial Revolution, and then they drew a picture of a gun, and that prompted a safety assessment. But the kind of weapon interest that mass school shooters show is they're looking at how to make explosives, they're looking at how to inflict maximum damage. If they're collecting chemicals, they tell their parents that they purchased them for a chemistry class. But here's the concerning fact that I want us to remember whenever we are doing a threat assessment. Half of the firearms that are done by school shooters, the firearms were not secured in a meaningful way. So kids either found them accessible in a cabinet or locked in a vehicle or hidden in a closet. And when we are both doing a suicide assessment or a threat assessment, it's imperative that we talk with the families about if they have a gun, what are they doing to keep it safe. What we know with adolescent suicide, and this is really robust literature, is if you have a gun in the house, you are 2 times more likely to have a teenager die by suicide. And that's a piece of information I think is really important for us to share with families. In many cases, other students were involved in some capacity. So this goes back to school climate, because if we have anonymous reporting and we know that that's encouraged, we have to have a school climate where kids feel like if I bring a concern, kid might bring a concern that there's vaping going on in the bathroom, or that there's going to be a fight after school, that they know that there's going to be a response. And I also think that we have to make an effort to educate our students, because sometimes what happens is kids will just assume, oh, that's just a kid that's just mouthing off, he's not going to do anything. And I think it's important for students to know that if there's a specificity, that they need to take it seriously. So if they hear a peer say, something big is going to happen on Monday, and make sure you don't come to school, then they ought to tell a school adult. And that they need to know that if they do bring it to a school adult, that it's going to be kept confidentially. And that this idea of a you're snitching on someone needs to be recognized, that by sharing information, they could be keeping a school safe. And I know I heard that there's some New Bedford folks listening today, and I certainly know we had a very moving example a few years back where kids being able to talk about, it actually wasn't New Bedford, it was in Bedford, but being able to talk about a potential danger really turned things around and averted a potential school shooting. So helping kids know that a specificity, date, time, weapons, that they need to let school adults know. So the Safe School Initiative also talked about key questions that to determine if a student poses a threat, and I just want to go over a few of them. Has the student shown inappropriate interest in any of the following: school attacks or attackers, weapons, incidents of mass violence? So many of the school shooters have watched online videos, been online, watched videos, watched documentaries, and what we're trying to establish when we're doing a safety assessment is the capacity to carry out an attack. Is there a consistency between the student's statements and actions? And so another important question that the Safe School Initiative reminds us in our assessments is the student experiencing hopelessness, desperation, or despair? And I want us, again, just shift a little bit and talk about David Schaffer's work. He was he did what are called psychological autopsies back in the 1980s, where he looked at sequential suicides. And what he showed was a third of the suicides that he looked at in children under 18 were kids that were antisocial. And what we know about mass school shooters is that 63% of them are depressed. So we don't have that kind of research in homicides as we do in suicides. But this idea of when we have a very provocative kid, to not lose sight that there may be underlying depression is incredibly important. And the other part is, and this is hard for us as mental health clinicians, is some of the school shooters actually had contact with mental health clinicians. But many times mental health clinicians don't have access to collateral support. You do in schools, but this whole idea of sending a kid to the emergency room to find out if they're safe to come back to school when they don't have collateral support is problematic. And we don't want to lose sight of how alone some people are that are being aggressive. And I had an example of a student where an ex-girlfriend brought a note to an administrator, and their concern was that he may be coming in to the school to kill the boyfriend, her new boyfriend. And he actually had been evaluated a few days before in a emergency room. The security guards had checked about whether he had access to a gun. And at that time, I had access to an ability for a psychiatric nurse to go to the home with a police officer. And what happened was they came to the door. The mother said that he wasn't home, the student, and they talked about what their concerns were. And then the boy came, well, he wasn't a boy, he was an adolescent teen, but he came from the back room and he said, yes, I've been, I need to talk to you. gotten a gun from his uncle, and he'd been thinking about killing himself, but he hadn't had the courage to pull the trigger. So this idea of keeping us vigilant around the desperation and despair is what I wanted to highlight with that question. This is actually, to me, this is a very heartening question that we might want to be identifying with our troubled students is, does the student have a trusting relationship with at least one responsible adult? And over time, when I've given these presentations, and I encourage any of you to please send me any great anecdotes that I can add into my talks, but people have really taken this to heart. And sometimes schools structurally, so I know there's some administrators here, have actually taken all the names of their students and all the staff members of their students and put it up as a sort of, and checked, does one adult in this building have a connection with this student? And after the Sandy Hook mass shootings, there was a 4th grade teacher who at end of the week, she would make a sociogram. So she would look at all the kids and see, well, what connections did each kid have? And she would figure out who were the students who were marginalized and try to make connections for them. And another elementary school teacher had kids put in a box who they would want to spend time with and figure out who the kids were that weren't picked. And so it's this idea that many times isolated kids have been struggling sometimes with social connection for a very long time. And how can we be intentional with making connections with them? Another aspect that I want to introduce to you to is Quaglia, Quaglia, and he's written a book on students' voices. And he has he's surveyed over 50,000 kids from all over the country. And he has actually a very simple question that he has us ask the staff and ask the students. And what he asks the staff is, do you think if a kid was in trouble that they would come to you? And then he asks the same question to the students. And what often comes up is that there's a gap between what the staff perceives, which over 100% of staff think that if kids are in trouble, they're going to come to them, maybe 90%. And sometimes it's 60% of students think that they would turn to a staff member. And it's just an opportunity to have a discussion as a school about how do we create a culture of safety where kids can come to us when they're worried. So, does the student see violence as acceptable or desirable or the only way to solve problems? So this is so disturbing, right? We have a climate right now where aggression is being sanctified in our political system. But Jim Garbarino wrote a book called Lost Boys, and this was looking at kids who were on death row. And what he showed was that kids had a shrinking sense of a very, very low threshold for aggression. And again, there's Jamie Barrett is a wonderful clinician. I worked with him for over 15 years at the Cambridge Health Alliance. He now works full-time for the Cambridge Police, and he developed a program. I have always thought that anger management problems are a bust, that you put in, and the research shows that you put it together a bunch of angry kids and teach them how to get angrier. And he developed a program called Fight Navigator, and I'm just going to briefly talk about it and I like some of the, just to encourage you to contact him if you think this is something your school wants. But it's really about the idea of helping train kids about an awareness of situations that promote fighting and how to mentally prepare themselves, how to exit from a fight. And so All right. Okay, I'm just going to tell you to stretch just 1 second as we move on to the next part. How are we doing with time? Oh gosh, I got to pick up the pace. All right. So some of you may be familiar with the evidence-based frameworks you need to bring back to your community to enhance your safety assessment process. But I'm about to introduce you to the granddaddy of safety assessments. What he did is, this is Dewey Cornell, and he has and you can go to schoolta.com. That's, it used to be called the Virginia Comprehensive Assessment, but it's been changed to the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines. So Dewey Cornell is brilliant. And this is the gold standard evidence-based practical guidelines. It's the best researched way that your school could do training. And now it's going to be all online, where it's a one-day training, and it took the Safe School Initiative and it puts it into 145-page manual, but you can also download all the questions on that website that they use in terms of the interview. But how it's evidence-based, it's been field tested. So it's looked at what happens when you try the model. There have been cross-sectional studies with how does the model compare to other schools that don't use this. And then there's a pre and post model testing that's been done. So how do schools change after accepting this model? And there's also been randomized control studies about what happens to schools who've randomly chosen, been assigned to use this model. And so it's robust. So what is this thing? Well, it's something where there's a decision tree process by the school-based teams where they look at making the decision, is this a transient threat or a substantive threat? And it has steps of implementation that I can say, having worked with school districts, often get skipped. So one of the things they make sure is to inform parents, students, and teachers about the process in place to keep kids safe. That's a key one that often gets missed. And then and what's important about that is then everybody knows what are our expectations. The other thing that it does, that aspect that it does, is there is a lot of misinformation around mass school shooters, about the level of threat in schools, and it provides information. It's similar to the information I'm giving you, like the fact that there's such a small percentage of schools that actually have had school shooters, and it shows the process of asking questions, which I think is really important. So part of it is that a school has to own the threat assessment process. They have to identify the student threat, evaluate the seriousness of the threat, intervene to reduce the risk, and follow up to assess intervention results. That is no small feat. And I just want to take a moment to ask people to write in the chat box. I'm going to ask Beth to read it out loud because I have this on presenter view. Where in this process do you find the most challenging? So is it in doing the follow-up and providing, and if you guys can just take a minute for right now and tell me where in the threat assessment process do you find the most challenge, and if you wanted to, how you've kind of gotten over that. So Beth, are you able to read if people understand the question?
Yeah, I'm here. I've got number 1, number 2, number 2, number 2, 2, 2.
Oh, good. This is going to be good then.
3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 2.
Oh, That's perfect. Yay. Okay. That's enough for me to keep
Okay.
moving. Because that's what Dewey Cornell's model is helping us do, right? He's and gives us a framework. So I'm gonna move on to the next. That's enough for me to keep moving then. Thanks. So what he's doing is just providing a framework. Having just done extensive research, if I had another life, I'd be Dewey Cornell, living in Virginia, getting the whole state of Virginia to be part of my research. And then, he's just a warhorse. So I like this way of looking at the continuum of threats. So he's going to use a language, transient versus substantive threat. So transient threats, and I'm going to say this a couple of times because I've been asked when I've done workshops, people don't always understand this. So if you're a seasoned clinician and you already got this done, just look at the way I'm trying to present this to help your staff grasp the concepts. And if you're a new clinician, don't worry, I'm going to be revisiting this in a couple of different angles to get us familiar with this. So transient threats are figures of speech, jokes, fleeting expressions of anger, which get resolved, attention seeking, boasting. And then you have the more substantive threats where you get the thrill of causing a disruption, attempts to intimidate or frighten, and then the seriously substantive where there's warnings of impending violence. And the important distinction that the comprehensive threat assessment model makes is if it's a serious substantive threat and a very serious substantive threat, these are legally requires protective measures to be taken to protect potential victims. And the serious substantive threat where you're threatening to kill someone is a felony. So just the transient versus substantive threat, and I'm going to show you some flow chart. The substantive threat, you have to take immediate precautions to protect potential victims, and you may end up consulting with the law enforcement and warning intended victims and victims' parents. And always, though, we're looking for ways to resolve the conflict and add services when needed. So transient threats, you conduct a safety assessment screen. So that often may happen with either the principal or the assistant principal in a middle school, or it could be the psychologist or the social worker. And there are minimal risks. There's a lack of detail. It's made in anger. There's a temporary frustration. And you definitely want to be considering the child's age, the credibility, and the discipline record. Usually it ends with an apology. And after the resolution, the threat no longer exists. The good news is 78% of threats made by kids are transient. And the reason why this is a really super important model is I can tell you from working with many districts, some districts are pouring energy into evaluating transient threats as if they're substantive threats. And then that means you run the risk of not really honing in on the substantive and the substantive threats. So it's important to be able to distinguish, because you don't want to be calling the safety assessment team together every time that there's a joke or a threat that happens during recess that doesn't warrant that level of attention. A substantive threat, there's an intent to physically harm beyond the immediate situation. So when in doubt, if you can't figure out whether it's transient or substantive threat, err on the side of thinking that it's a substantive threat. And it could be carried out, but it's not realistic. There's no signs of preparatory steps having been taken. But there's statements that the student makes that want to convey that the threat isn't empty. And serious substantive threats are the threat to kill or use a lethal weapon. So that will have protective actions taken. The mental health personnel on the safety assessment team will screen to see if there's needed services that need to happen. The law enforcement investigate planning and preparation, and if a crime is committed, they move forward with that. And in the serious substantive threat, a student may be suspended temporarily while the assessment's being done. And what's important in that, in the substantive and serious substantive threat, but particularly, is that the threats are direct and specific. And the idea of imminent serious danger is plausible. So just to go through the flow chart that the comprehensive threat assessment model has, the step one is you obtain a specific account of the threat, and you write down the content of the threat and the statements by each part of the threat, and you document your evaluation. And some of the kind of questions you may ask, they're questions you already probably do. Why do I want to talk to you? This isn't confidential. What happened? What exactly did you say and do? What are you going to do now? And you're looking at the credibility and the seriousness of the threat. And then you make the decision. Is this, at this point, does it seem transient or substantive? If it's transient, you respond to the, you might be a social skills lesson that you want to give the student, or you may try to have some kind of conflict resolution that's going on. And then with substantive, again, it's then the threat assessment team comes together, and you consider contacting the law enforcement, and you notify the student's parents of the intended victim, and you're looking at severity and chronicity. And what's important is, I think, that the mental health clinician, and sometimes this isn't happening, so that's why I'm saying this. Many times mental health clinicians are being asked to do these assessments and don't have a team coming together to support them. And that's not fair to the mental health clinician, because there is an aspect where you need the support of the school resource officer or the local police to be able to identify some of the aspects that we talked about, like is the student doing an internet search on weapons, and so then you respond to the substantive threat. And then the important aspect also is to have a safety plan. And one of the aspects that I see often schools get tripped up on is they don't think enough about the transition of the student. If the student doesn't end up being suspended or expelled, and they come back into the school, about the transition back into the school. And also that sometimes you have a mental health clinician talk about interventions that need to happen, but there's not the attention on follow through. So those are key aspects just to remember that you want to do. So I just want to now take a moment and go through these to have, and Beth, I'm going to ask you to look in the chat box so I know what people are saying, but just type in whether you think this is a transient or substantive threat. So a second grader makes this picture. He's often disruptive in class. He comes from a troubled background, and this picture is drawn, and the family is called and told that he needs an evaluation in the emergency room to say he is, quote unquote, safe to come back to school. Do you think this is a transient or substantive threat?
Transient depends on severity and duration. Transient.
Okay.
Transient.
So what if I told you that the teacher had overheard kids talking, and this same student was bragging that his older brother had a gun and he knew where it was in the house, and he got spanked when he got home, and if he got spanked when he got home, that the other kids would be sorry? Transient or substantive?
Substantive, sub,
Yeah.
sub.
Perfect. Okay. So age does matter, but context is key. And I think for me, this highlights the travesty we're doing when we're sending kids off to emergency rooms. Because an emergency room clinician, usually the kid is already kind of de-escalated when they arrive in the emergency room, and they don't have access to that information. So it's bogus. If the clinician sends back a letter saying they're safe to be in school, and I try to train my child psychiatrists and clinicians not to do that, it's a false sense of security, and you've missed key information. And that's why a safety assessment team is so critical within the school, because you all have access to collateral information, and you have access to leakage that people outside of the school don't have. A student comes to the guidance counselor and tells her that over lunch, he heard another kid talking about a hit list and that his friend should skip school on Monday. What do you think? Transient or substantive? What are they saying, Beth? Oops, I can't hear you, Beth. Can you hear me?
S, substantive.
Good. Okay, we're going to keep moving. See, you all have already, but this is what you want to be doing with your staff if you already are totally trained about this, but is to get them to recognize that there is a way of beginning to make a distinction about what kind of threat. And a kid in a self-contained classroom says he wants to blow up the school after a fight during recess where he didn't think he got treated fairly. After talking to him, he says that he's sorry and that he just wanted to play. What do they think?
T, transient, T.
Perfect. Okay. Right. A second grade girl has told you that during recess, a boy told her, "I'm going to rape you." The boy started to cry when the teacher started to talk with him and said he didn't know what rape was, but he was sorry. What do you think?
T.
Great.
T.
Okay, you all are. Okay. A 10th grader with gang involvement who was placed in an alternative high school had a fight the night before. He comes through a fire door that was propped open with a fire extinguisher and is seen in the corridors by a teacher who recognizes him, and he's carrying a large duffel bag. What do you think?
S.
Yeah.
S.
Yeah.
S.
I would say SS, seriously substantive. And the point here of why I have this slide is call 911. Don't be thinking about bringing together, it's called lockdown and 911. And that, sometimes that, yes, I'm introducing this model and there's a place for instant action and not investigating. And that's something you want to be thinking about in your school, that everybody knows when is the time that you do that. So I want to go back to this idea. I'm just going to share with you the research that Dewey Cornell's team has done, and just remind us of the fact that in many schools, we have a disproportion of African Americans being suspended. So 11% of middle school students nationwide were suspended, but 33% of Black middle school students were suspended. And 16% of the overall population are Black girls, and 39% of girls are arrested in schools are Black. So why I'm sharing this is to highlight Dewey Cornell's research with using the comprehensive threat guidelines. There were weather controlling for school size, the percentage of low income students, and the percentage of minority students. There were 15% fewer short-term suspensions per year, 25% fewer long-term suspensions per year, and school authorities were more likely to hold a parent conference, and families were more likely to access mental health counseling services. And the reason I'm telling you this is if you are an ambassador to the school, someone who's going to be bringing this information, this is key information to highlight if you were presenting to your school committee or to your superintendent that the research on evidence-based threat assessment, because unfortunately, and especially, there are so many different models that are being thrown out. And I think that highlighting that the racial disparities were reduced or absent, and so that this process made, there was less vulnerability to discriminatory bias is super important. And the idea that counseling is used more often, and that it contributed to a more positive school climate. This is to say, I haven't heard it as much as Massachusetts. I've heard it in New Hampshire and Florida, but there's something very strange that's happening where schools are collapsing the threat assessment with the suicide assessment. And I think that's really dangerous. And Dewey Cornell has done, I reached out to him when I heard about it happening, and he, of course, had done research on this. So if you all want that paper, if you have a school that's doing that, what happened is people made this sort of, I don't mean to be insulting, but it's an unsophisticated assumption that since some mass school shooters have gone on to have killed themselves when they've killed victims, therefore, if you're suicidal, you should have a threat assessment done on you to make sure you're not a school shooter. That is flawed logic. And it's also really dangerous. We are much more sophisticated in providing a suicide assessment. And we do not, and we know that 20% of kids in a 1-year period, according to the CDC data, have thoughts of suicide. Clearly many more than end up being school shooters. So if we end up stigmatizing kids who are suicidal, we'll shut down them telling us that. So it's a plea to you that if your school is doing that, there is research that shows that's not necessary, and in fact, it can be damaging. So, oh, I'm supposed to say that. So that's a big stretch, right? If you're suicidal, you become a school shooter. So I just, because we are now at 8:25, I want to have us just do a quick stretch. That's my interactive moment with you all. Just to shake our brains up and wake us up. Okay. So how do we create a reflexive process that builds capacity to, I know I gave you a really small, small break. How do we create a reflexive process that builds capacity to support families, schools, and students? So, I've worked in schools for 25 years. We tend to be a flavor of the month, kind of, we pick one thing, like it's going to be the year of bullying, or it's going to be the year of ADD, or it's going to, and I think being comprehensive and really allowing us to go deep, which is what I hope we can do in this 10-hour webinar, is really important. And what's happening sometimes is they're sloppy assessments, and we're going to hear more about that from Goodrum, but we need to have schools that are going to adjust their protocols and this is from Goodrum's work. I'm just giving you a teaser, but when she did her analysis of her case study on threat assessments and looked at, took hours and hours of depositions for a case in Colorado where a student underwent a threat assessment and then later killed a classmate and himself on school grounds. What it showed was that the student's behavior had really unfolded over several months in several different school settings and among various school staff. And in addition, he had begun planning the attack shortly after his threat assessment and several months before his the shooting, but the follow-up didn't happen, and there hadn't been an effort by the school psychologist to gather information from other collateral people. There was the mistaken assumption that people would come forward to talk to the school psychologist rather than that she solicited the information. And the threat assessment team only included 2 members, an assistant principal and a school psychologist, and not the 4 or 5 members that were recommended by the US Secret Service and the Department of Education. And the training program for the safety assessment was a 2-hour in-service and didn't offer any hands-on scenario practices or role playing or coaching. And what she showed was 5 characteristics, and she'll talk more about that with us the next time, which is so fun, I can't wait. But that when you have a culture of safety, that you need to have people who are informed on the appropriate protocol and promotes reporting, and that there's an atmosphere of trust and it's flexible and you learn to adjust. So I don't know how many of you have watched the documentary, The Challenger, but that's an analysis about small errors that get brushed over, and that in a school that's a safe school, you want to be able to look at your failures and not avoid it and push it away, but allow it as an opening to be reflective. This is just, if you have time, this is a climate survey that Goodrum recommends that has it's a survey that asks both kids and parents and staff to read these questions and then rate how strongly they agree or strongly disagree, to get a temperature of whether or not there's a shared understanding of safety. And so just to run you through some of the sample questions. If another student was involved in unsafe or dangerous behavior, I would report it anonymously without anyone knowing it was me. If I report unsafe or dangerous behavior, I can be sure that the problems will be taken care of as soon as possible. My school has a simple vocabulary about what to do in the event of an emergency. And my school has a shared vocabulary that is used by police staff and students about what to do in the event of an emergency. I wanted to give you a flavor for that. This is just a reminder about that at part of the expectation with a safety assessment team is to have had a full day of training and to have some role playing. When we talk about the culture of safety, I just wanted to share an example of where I was really moved in a presentation I gave. There was a principal who shared with me, there was a second grader who had brought in a bullet casing for show and tell. And how the district responds with communication to the community and works with the school resource officer in this situation was really a beautiful example of containing fear. So the student had gotten kind of nervous and said, I found it at the beach. That, they did a safety assessment. The staff rumor mill had started, and we know how those rumors start. And it was going around the school gossip chain that someone brought a bullet. And I just want to read you the note that was sent out to the school to show this kind of containment of when we do an assessment, and as a really nice example. Good afternoon. The administration received a report today that an inoperable empty shell casing was found at school. When discovered, the casing was immediately brought to the office. The blank police department was notified and assisted with the investigation at school. It was determined that the casing was an empty historical artifact and was not a safety concern. Parents of students involved have been contacted. And then this is again highlighting the teachable moment. As a reminder, artifacts such as shell casings are not permitted on school grounds or on school buses. The safety of our students is our highest priority. We continue to take appropriate steps to ensure the safety of all students in accordance with educational law and the school community policies. Please contact me if you have any questions. I just think that's a lovely example. I don't want you to get feeling too loaded down about how you could take what could have become an incident where parents would come and pull their kids, to really being able to be contain anxiety. This is a reminder. Many of us in Massachusetts have had to adopt the Sandy Hook anonymous reporting, and just how important it is to make sure we get all folks on board, like the custodians, the food service workers, the contractors, and Now, of course, it's so funny right now because half of us aren't in school, but when we do get in school, and actually, and parents, and just and the other aspect that I want to have us think about is that having a good safety assessment process in place really allows us to interrupt the school to prison pipeline. And that restorative justice, I've heard from many schools, are adopting this. And sometimes I get the question, though, what's the difference between restorative justice and retributive justice? And it's a good question I would want you guys to ask yourself is, what are we doing in our school, and can we shift it? So retributive justice is what rule is broken, who broke it, and what's the punishment for breaking that rule. And restorative justice is really about what harm was done, what action would repair that harm, and who's responsible for that repair. And it's really trying to, in the restorative justice, you're paying attention to relationships. You're talking with students about how do they need to repair and make amends. And that can be very powerful. So, and we're don't worry, we have about 10 more minutes. I'm going to open it up for questions, but how do you get your school to buy in and anticipate obstacles? So many times in my training of school districts, my participants tell me, basically, you're teaching to the choir. I'm the team chair, I'm the assistant principal. I know this needs to happen, but I can't get my staff to buy in. So I when I was doing one of these luxurious 5-day trainings, I asked Rachel Polliner, who is a wonderful psychologist, and she did an all-day in-service on school climate with these districts. And this was something I thought was really a helpful piece in addressing buy-in. So I think often as a team chair or as a administrator, we aren't intentional with telling our staff, where am I in the process of making this decision? So let me just give you an example. Okay, as a team leader, when you walk into an IEP, many times, even if half the team has decided that this kid needs an out-of-district placement, that decision is usually made outside of a team meeting. I'm probably stepping on every legal thing, but you're not going to go spend $80,000 without having talked with your director of special ed. And so there are certain decisions that are you want to be transparent about how you're making the decision. So I like this framework that Rachel Polliner shared, which is, it comes from the 5th Discipline Handbook, which is a tool for looking at the styles of making and communicating decisions. And there are reasons for using and not using each of the decision-making processes at certain times, and for switching among them. So tell is basically, you're in charge, it's an emergency, and you're going to tell people what to do. Sell is, and this is where I have been all in this last hour and a half trying to talk to you about, how do you persuade a district to take on something like Dewey Cornell's comprehensive threat assessment? And test is, you're going to implement a system such as dismissal or hybrid learning, and you're going to kind of keep reconfiguring it. And I would argue that in a culture of safety, you're also talking about, we're going to do threat assessments, we're going to analyze it afterwards, we're going to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And consult is, you need input from people with different views once gathered to make decisions. And so, for instance, maybe it's around doing the safety assessment and how you're going to build that, or around a mentoring program for teaching. And then collaborate is that everyone needs to own the decision and be able to implement it creatively and subtly in their own setting. So that may be, for instance, if you were going to change from retributive justice to restorative justice, you're going to really need the collaboration of each teacher and the administrators as they're working with kids that are dysregulated. So we could spend another 20 minutes on that, but so I just wanted to ask you, what challenges have you faced when it comes to getting buy-in from your school, if you have? And I'm just going to take a minute to ask you that and see if Beth, you can tell me the answers.
Fear.
Great. Anything else?
Zero tolerance mentality.
Ah, yes.
Not enough time. Admin has too much on their plate.
These are great. I mean, not great that they're confronting them, but they're the pulse of the school.
Focus on punishment, being reactive, turf issues, changes in admin or staffing. I would agree there is no time to facilitate this, but it all makes sense.
That's so honest.
There are resource gaps.
Yeah.
Not including school psychologists in decision-making, just administrators forming policies among themselves. And again, not enough time for training for staff.
Yep.
Lack of focus on problem solving. The ALSUP by Ross Green is so easy and so useful.
Yep.
Having everyone on the same page is also key in the communication about how we carry this out in ways which make sense. Always push to the side for curriculum initiatives. I agree, keeping all of the right providers is important.
This is great. Any others, Beth? Or I just want to, I can address the.
Oh, there's one, voice not valued.
Oh, okay. So let me just briefly look at some of these. So fear. I think fear comes from not having information. So that's why I'm trying to give this information to you in ways that you might be able to share it with your community. I think staff need to know about perception of threat is different than actual threat in schools, and that's something important for us to be able to convey. I think if we don't use a systematic way of implementing threat assessments, it is fairly chaotic. I would ask that each of you think about getting either the ear of the superintendent or using an ally that gets the ear of the superintendent so that they know what the expectations are, because I think superintendents don't want to have good systems in place. The time element is a process of negotiation. I mean, there's never time in schools. It's a constant battle about, especially when now you have the pandemic. So people are just trying to figure out how to get into the building safely, let alone be there and have a process in place. But and I think the idea that they're excluding the school psychologist, I think it just has to be, and you know, educators don't like conflict. That's something I've noticed over the years, but that's something where whoever has made that decision not to involve a psychologist has actually put themselves in a very vulnerable position. But I'm also going to, Goodrum and I are going to do a role play about sort of how do you have difficult discussions in a staff setting where, so just as a teaser. Okay. Thank you, you all. Oh, resource gaps. That's a perennial one. Let me just get to I'll come back to that, I think. So I did research with families. Since I've done 20 years of doing safety assessments, I went back to families and students and asked them. It was a fairly small cohort, but it's the only study in the country looking at the experience of families and students with their experience of having a threat safety assessment. And What they said, which I really loved, is that one student said that they wish that there was an ambassador, someone who sort of helped the family and the student navigate during the threat assessment. And um, and that's clearly why having a mental health clinician on the team is really important. And I was thinking to myself, okay, how do you return to your community as a well-equipped safety ambassador? If that's what I'm asking you to do now, I would say bring the language back to your district about transient versus substantive. Think about whether there's a possibility, if you've got lots of overturn, can you get an investment in your school doing online training, your safety assessment team for the comprehensive school threat assessment guidelines. The other aspect I would say is, and again, somebody has to have time to think about this stuff because it's the way your school will function better. And I just want to take a moment when we're thinking about coordination. I had the Children's Hospital has did an all-day training, and this was some of the information I thought was really helpful in thinking about a behavioral crisis and how you want to plan for it. And I like these questions, what is a behavioral health crisis? How does your school define a behavioral health crisis? Because I've seen such variability within schools. And I think that, is it what staff should be consulted when there's a crisis, and what's the flow of communication? And defining a point person for each crisis in helping to coordinate information and communication, and having the decision process around who it would be helpful to include. And that's, I think, goes back to the flow chart that Dewey Cornell's team talked about. And then having discussions about what to do's in the moment if you're with a student in crisis. Where do you bring the student? What happens if you're alone in the classroom? Where does the class go if everyone needs to leave the room? And going back to the ambassador, what's the process for contacting families? And to streamline the coordination and the confidentiality. And thinking about in an emergency, what do you do if you can't reach a family member? And which emergency services could be used when they should be used, and having the contact information for individuals and agencies. And key, what is the process for follow-up after crisis? So I don't think we have a choice about if we really want to be meeting the needs of our kids about answering these types of questions. One of the things I've seen around safety threat assessments is an overuse of the ambulance. That ends up being often an out-of-pocket cost for the parents. And so having a protocol for when it's necessary to call the emergency room in 911. And I would strongly discourage the idea of sending to outside clinicians the question, is this kid safe to come back to school? And it's happening a lot, and it's not protective of the school. One other thing I would say is incident reports I frequently see when I've done safety assessments, huge detailing about the actual incident with very little about the antecedent. So I've encouraged districts to put an antecedent in the incident report so that folks begin to think about that. And I also encourage, when you call a family, many families in my research didn't quite understand what was expected from them. So being able to be very explicit about the observable behavior that you've noted is also super helpful. This goes without saying that it's important to connect to families before there's a crisis, and so you have a relationship with them, and review support plans for students and collaborate with providers. with the internet policy, and we'll go in great more depth with it in December 4th, but it's just a note that you may want to pull the internet policy and see if it needs any modification, and have some questions for Meredith about that. And think about how is it communicated to your constituents, the internet policy. So this is a good part. Tell me you learned something. What is one takeaway from today's session that you can bring back to your school as an ambassador? I just want to give you a minute to write that in the chat box. And Beth, if you're able to read those out, that'd be really helpful.
Yep, I'm just waiting.
Please say something, you guys.
Not to rely on an outside therapist to gauge safe to return to school. They should be informing the school nurse when a child is going out. Age does not matter, but context is key. The importance of determining whether a situation is transient or substantive, taking appropriate steps. We need to collaborate with the schools in order to better handle situations. Communication, relationships. Importance of having a team and protocols and procedures put in place ahead of time. Roles and responsibilities must be clarified for all professionals.
I love this group. We're going to have so much fun. Sorry, Beth. Great. I'm going to remind everybody the next time we start the lessons learned so they can hold on to them. These are delicious. Sorry, Beth, keep going.
Okay. When you're in your own culture, you don't notice it, you just absorb it. I think we need to remember this idea, as it is easy to take things for granted or be complacent. We need to look at ourselves with fresh eyes.
Look at ourselves how?
With fresh eyes.
You there?
Look at ourselves with fresh eyes.
Beautiful.
Let's see. I wonder, as a new member of a community in school, I wonder sometimes the reasoning why behind some of these decisions, and having been part of many situations as a teacher, I never understood why I just did the protocols.
So it's saying that now, can I just riff on that a little bit? It says to me that that's why we want to make sure that even though we have 700 other things we need to train our staff in, that we need to help them understand the protocols we're adopting, because it's going to help teachers feel like they're being treated like an adult, and that they're not being asked to just follow because it's a protocol, but they understand the reasoning behind it.
Mm-hmm. Importance of a comprehensive and collaborative team.
Yeah. I do not want people to be alone. That's why I'm here. Sharing responsibility is key. Otherwise you burn out. So definitely. All right. So now that I know we only have 8 more minutes, I'm going to keep moving. Unless, are there any more, Beth? Because these are delicious. They're so fun.
There's one more here. The importance of protocols and the overuse of relying on outside clinicians to authorize students to return to school, the overuse of ambulances, the importance of clarifying what we expect from parents.
Oh, nice. Thank you so much. That's really good, because if any of us end up not, because the problem with using outside folks, and I am an outside folk, I'm a child psychiatrist, I worked with schools to go into the schools to get the collateral support. But if you have an outside clinician who is not working with you guys, you are not protected legally, because they don't have access to the information. Anything else, or we're good?
We're good.
Okay, great. Thank you, you guys. Okay, so we have now just finished my part of Beyond the Threat and how to tip balance towards safety in schools while considering challenges and the needs of individual students. And I want to briefly go over, just because some of you might have come in a little bit later and just because I've gone through so much information about what's coming up. So we still have Sarah Goodrum. She'll be here on October 16th. That's the day after my birthday. And she'll be sharing, I shouldn't say it so happily because she's sharing something that's kind of intense, a school shooting study, and examining the role of information in identifying, evaluating, and managing a student of concern. And then we have Dr. Weisbrot, who's that clinician I told you that has extensive experience on how, when to really worry and what to do about it, including the brilliant idea she gave to me of like, what's the direct line to FBI, which I'd never thought about needing or using, but she uses. Then we have Michelle Garcia Winner and Laura Thibodeau, who will be talking with us about kids on the spectrum and how to approach that challenging behavior. And then Dr. Ganser, who will be talking with us about how to navigate with the social media and threatening behavior. So we covered a lot of ground: preventative efforts, school climate, consistent safety assessment protocol, restorative justice. And in the end, what I would say to you is we need to have human detectors, not metal detectors, and human-centered change. I'm so glad that you took the time to be with me today. And we do have 5 minutes. Before that, though, I'm going to tell you the code that you want to put into your computer, which is 2, and then little letter N, little letter B. That's it. And I wanted to switch it to Q&A. If there's anybody who wants to ask a question in the chat box, I'm going to end this part. But there's my email, nancy@nancyrappaport.com, and my website, nancyrappaport.com. If you put into the search engine safety assessments, there's a ton of articles that I've written that will pop up. And great. So hold on. How do I do this to get me back to, I want to be able to see the chat box. Should I stop share and then restart it again? Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Do that.
Okay.
Just stop sharing your screen and then you could probably pull up the chat.
Okay. Well, if people wanted to ask me questions while I'm figuring this out, I can, okay, got it. I can answer things. So I'm screen sharing right now, right? But I can't see the chat, so.
Yeah, I don't think you need to share your screen, Nancy. Just go down to the chat at the bottom.
Okay, great. All right, let me see if there's, I don't see any questions yet. Does anybody have questions? Am I missing anything, Beth, or is there no questions?
No, no questions. I think lots of thank yous.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I can't wait to see you guys in a couple of weeks. And we have an amazing co-host. So I will look forward to that and have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Thank you.
Great, Nancy, I can't thank you enough. That was so full of information, and you have such a good handle on this. Someone had written in the chat about psychologists, excuse me, psychologists turning into testing machines.
Yeah.
I have to, that really resonated with me.
Yeah.
It's a shame because psychologists are so well trained and there's so much else that they can be helpful with. And it has been my experience that school psychologists get so overburdened with the testing piece.
Right.
And
I know.
also wonder, another conversation for another day, how all that is going, how assessment is going in these days of COVID. I mean, it's got to make
Right.
it a little bit different. That could be.
No, I think being able to tap into the strength of clinicians and being able to have them have I have seen some school districts that do have psychologists work on the primary and the secondary interventions so that you can decrease the referrals so you don't have to do as much testing. But it does take vision at the top to be able to do that, whether it's a terrific director of special education or a superintendent that or a principal that says this is a priority to move you in that role. And because we know I know from working in school settings that psychologists and social workers and mental health counselors and LMHC, they are the heartbeat of schools often, and can make the difference they may end up being the trusting adult that we're talking about that can make a difference to turning around a kid's life. And I'm grateful to the work that you all are doing, definitely.
We're grateful to you for presenting such a wonderful webinar today. And I want to remind people, I see people asking, where do we put the code? Is it 6 digits? Yes. If you didn't hear the first 3, you were not at the beginning, because Nancy very clearly said small m, small d, 7 at the beginning. Then she added 2, small n, small b. So that definitely adds up to 6 digits.
And you never know. You might have just been like getting your kid off to virtual learning, or trying to get over the fact that our president has COVID, whatever. So totally understand that life happens, but
Yeah,
I so appreciate.
I want to make it clear that 6 digits were given.
Yeah.
We're happy to give them again now at the end. Somebody just said that they had MD. Did somebody write ND? Yes, MD, like in medical doctor, small letters.
MD.
2 NB, and all of the letters are lowercase.
Okay.
That's just wrote it in. So yes.
Okay.
Okay, and a screen is going to come up in a second when we say goodbye to Nancy. Beth will be posting a screen that has all the information about PDPs, CEUs, etc. And all that information is also available on our website. So I thank everybody very, very much for tuning in today. I know there'll be some people watching remote, and
MPY. Thank you to MPY and Margie and Beth. And there's someone else
much
behind the scenes that does all this too. But
Lauren.
Lauren, y'all are providing a great resource to be able to disseminate really critical information. So
thank you. When you mention the people that are just so crucial and integral in school districts, your social workers, your psychologists, your guidance counselors, your nurses, your school adjustment counselors, that's the bulk of the people that that are tuning into us, and others are always welcome. During the summer, we had more regular education teachers and paraprofessionals than we ever had, which we were thrilled about. But certainly these are open to anyone in member districts. But I do have to say that the mental health people really are the heart and soul of school districts. There's no two ways.
I almost wish that you could post this on Monday so that if any of your educators wanted to pull in and do a quick, have people watch this, they could. So if they had their safety assessment team, they
can only do that if people have registered. We just can't put it
there. Got it. Sorry, I'm causing trouble at the end. Goodbye.
People should feel free to register if they know they can't make any of the sessions, but that way they get to the link.
If some people watching it want to get the rest of their team on there, can they register now after the first for the last 8 hours? Oh, okay. All right, I'm such a troublemaker. Goodbye now.
With PDPs and CDUs.
Sure. Okay.
There's a lot of accountability issues. Anyway, I thank everybody very, very much. At the top of the list, Dr. Nancy Rappaport, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Friday and a fabulous weekend. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.